Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the 10 Laws podcast with East Forest. I am that East person. Sometimes I'm called Forrest. This week, I have a conversation with Jason Prall. Jason is an interesting guy who wrote an entire book about longevity, but not just like specifically living longer, but also how to live better longer. And it's a deep subject, of course, and it gets far beyond just the surface level of our health. He also worked on a film project called the Human Longevity Film.com. You can go see, they have all these different episodes. They went all around the world with his friend, John Dahlgren, who's a friend of mine. We're working on, he's one of the partners on the documentary project that we're working on. They talked to all these people in the blue zones, that live for a very long time. And so that's a very human story in itself. So there's a lot to dig into there, and we had a fascinating conversation, and so I'm glad that we were finally able to make it happen, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. I did want to let you know that the Esalen Retreat is up and live. It's filling up quickly. If you'd like to sign up for that, check it out. It's at eastforest.org. Hit the retreat tab or the tour tab. That's June 30th through July 3rd. We also just announced we're going to be, this is myself and my partner Marissa Rod-Wepner, at the Love Serve Remember Ram Dass Retreat. They're doing one again in North Carolina, up in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Boone, North Carolina, and that's going to be in August. So that just went online. That one can fit some more people, so see if that's a good fit for you there. That's also at eastforest.org, and I'm going to be at Tree Fort. That'll be my next sort of concert, and that'll be here in Boise, Idaho. It's pretty much my favorite music festival, Tree Fort Music Fest, and that's the third week of March. It's an urban festival, so you kind of walk around to different venues and just get a hotel or something. It's not like a camping thing, which I like. I like that. I'll also be doing Yoga Fort happens. There's like sub forts inside Tree Fort during the daytime. I'll be doing some live music accompaniment for Radha's class, yoga class. That's on Sundays when I'm performing for both of those. But Yoga Fort happens, I think, every day of the festival. You can get a pass just for Yoga Fort or for Tree Fort and cross currents with all the other little forts. Super fun. Check it out. And I do want to say thank you to some new folks who signed up on the Patreon. Patreon's a way to support this podcast. And I share lots of things there that I don't share anywhere else. Lots of unreleased music, and we do a monthly Zoom council and all sorts of fun things. So thank you to Catherine, Bob, Brian, Ivo, Leah. Thank you for signing up recently. And everyone else, of course, is on our council on various levels, because there's all sorts of smaller, less expensive levels, of course, to a few bucks, up to lots of bucks. If you have bucks and you'd like to support the East Forest Project, it means a lot. It is very helpful. There are real-world costs that go into this podcast, and of course, many of the other things we do, both some in the spirit of the gift and some things out there that are monetized like streaming or events, but it's all part of a larger picture to just try to keep things going and keep the wheels on this bus turning. So thank you for that. Last thing I'm going to say is I just got back from my darkness retreat, and it was a lot, and so I don't even want to get into it now because I'm still processing it, and I think I'll do some kind of episode where I can tell you more about that, because it was, a lot came up, and I think it's quite interesting, and maybe I'll do that in a solo cast, or I'll do that in a conversation with someone like Radha. I'd also like to get Scott, who is there on the podcast, kind of talk about the concept in general, because on the face of it, I think we know, okay, you're in the dark alone, but there's more, and there's a lot of thinking about why that is an interesting or useful medicine or not, and so forth and so on. So more soon on that. Feeling very tender and very raw coming out of that, but also feeling very open and clear. And that space is like, sometimes like the stories you start to tell about an experience, in many ways that story can become the experience, right? Like the memory of it, you start to shape it in your memory through the story. And so I'm very conscious of that in not yet wanting to go into story zone, because it feels very alive. So don't worry. Not that you're worried. I'll tell you about it more soon. But thank you to Sky Cave Retreats for hosting me there. And special thank you to Adrian, who is the somatic and craniosacral worker there. That was truly some amazing work. Yeah. And this conversation will fade out near the end. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, we're going to share that over on the Patreon. So again, patreon.com/eastforest. If you'd like to hear the rest of this, we got into some kind of side, interesting, more esoteric subjects, and philosophical, which I thought was fun. And that's what you hear when it fades out. Okay, but for now, let's get into this conversation with our new friend, Jason Prall. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. You doing good?
I'm doing great. Yeah, we were just talking about the weather down here in San Diego. We finally turned sunny, so I'm back to normal. It got a little depressing for a while. We got a lot of rain, so I feel good.
I grew up in Oregon, so I mean, I certainly know firsthand what it's like not to have much sunlight at all for a long time. But at the same time, like when people in San Diego complain about,
I know.
It's been rainy for 2 weeks, I'm like, so?
Yeah, we get conditioned pretty easily.
Yeah, but I'm a sun freak as well. I mean, now I'm more in the high desert places is where I've been hanging out, mostly for the sun. So I get it. I mean, that sort of gets into a subject that you're interested in writing about, which is kind of wellness more than longevity, but I don't know, you could tell me. And I would imagine sunlight has a lot to do about that. I mean, is that like us picking up on an intuition that's vitally important for wellness and health?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's interesting when we get back to the fundamentals of what humanity is, and when our roots as a species on this planet, before we started putting ourselves in boxes, most of the day, we were either in a region that had a lot of sun, right, or some blend of sun and through the seasons, or we found ourselves in these regions that it's a ton of cold, the Arctic regions. And what you find there is an absence of sun, particularly during the winter and in the fall and the spring, very long, dark winters, but you had cold, right? So interestingly enough, now in the West, as we've isolated ourselves from temperatures and light conditions, we're finding ourselves going back into the cold for the same type of thing, right? There's an intuitive call to the temperature, which sort of induces a lot of the same effects as the sun. So when we're absent of sun, getting in the cold can boost all kinds of hormones and neurochemicals to bring that mood up, right? So that depressive sort of seasonal affective disorder that I'm so familiar with growing up in Seattle area, we can flip that on its head by just getting in the cold, right? But we sort of isolated
like a cold bath, or is that what you're talking about, or are you just saying just like going outside in a cold climate?
Both, but prior to this modern way of living, we were in the cold. Like there wasn't, furnaces, there wasn't, we had fire, but we were cold. And so by consistent, this kind of cold, consistent temperatures, they would actually prevent this seasonal affective disorder, right? So it's these things that we're kind of navigating in this modern world in our modern way, whether it's an infrared sauna or whether it's an ice bath, or sort of these solar therapy devices. There's all kinds of stuff that we're now utilizing in our modern world, but it is an intuitive feeling. And of course we have the science now to back it up too. We know cold shock proteins and heat shock proteins are these things at the sort of cellular level that induce changes at the cellular level that create different switches, that turn on different switches epigenetically. So there's all kinds of stuff going on, but this is an intuitive feeling, no doubt, that we have.
But what about if your genetic line, it was more like equatorial? It's not like northern latitudes above the 45th latitude, for instance. Is this like, are we talking this goes way back, you think, as a human thing? But it sounds to me like you're saying it developed from the way people lived in certain climates for perhaps millennia, but there might have been other people who didn't live like that.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, we're ultimately humans, and all life really, but humans are probably the supreme example of this, of being unbelievably adaptable to all conditions and climates and food sources and lack of food, right? We can adapt to pretty much any condition, mentally, physically, emotionally, energetically. So it's really amazing when we think about our ability to traverse this planet. There's not a lot of species of animals and plants that can navigate the different elevations and submarine. And I mean, it's unbelievable what we can do. And so what we find, if getting back to sort of the core of humanity, we should find two. Well, let me back up a little bit. So there's three primary genetic components to a human being, right? There's three big genomes that we can classify. One is our human genome, right? This is the DNA that we're also familiar with. But then we have mitochondria, which are typically thought of as the powerhouse of the cell. They generate energy. They also produce hormones. They take out the trash. They signal. There's mitochondria are these little organelles within us that do a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. They have their own genome. So there's mitochondrial genes, and these are actually circular in nature. So there's a mitochondrial genome, there's a human genome, and then we now know with the microbiome and a lot of research, we have microbes, right? And these include all kinds of different bacteria and helminths and parasites, if you want to think of them that way, and all kinds of different organisms, protozoa, and they have their own genome, right? And we're all living in this sort of rainforest-like experience. So, and to be honest, you're more bacterial genome than you are human genome, right? So we know that these genomes are carrying out function. And without any microbes in you, you would die, right? In you and on you. So it's hard to even really determine what a human is. So I think with that sort of framework, there's two things that are really curious about the human lineage. One is that you have mitochondrial genes, right? These come from your mother. At least as far as we can tell right now through science, that's what we understand. So your mitochondria come from your mother. Her mitochondria came from her mother, right? Your father's mitochondria came from his mother. So the mitochondria that we all have all come through the female lineage. So if you have a female lineage that primarily runs, let's say, through Africa, right, and it's a very strong African lineage, then you have African mitochondria, right, sure, within you. But your father's side, let's say, or runs through Sweden, right? And so you have Swedish, let's say, mitochondria from his side and DNA, let's say, that's primarily from Sweden. So you could have Swedish human DNA and African mitochondrial DNA. And there's a famous researcher named Douglas Wallace who may end up winning a Nobel Prize, to be honest, for his work in mitochondrial science. He's actually traced the patterns of migration of humanity through what's called mitochondrial haplotypes. So in other words, different types of mitochondrial genetics, you can trace that back through history and see where humans have migrated. And what you find is that mitochondria, just like all genes, they start to adapt and change. This is what we might call epigenetics. Over long periods of time, mitochondria starts to change because it changes to the different energetic aspect of the environment. Equatorial Africa, for example, or India, or any equatorial region has a ton of heat. So you don't want your mitochondria producing a ton of heat. You want it being very efficient by producing a lot of ATP and doing signaling that way. Whereas if you came from, let's say, through the migration patterns of humanity over time, let's say into Sweden or in the Arctic regions, those mitochondria are actually going to produce ATP for energy, of course, but also produce a ton of heat. So mitochondria can produce heat. We have something called uncoupling proteins. And I'm getting really down into the weeds here.
Pretty wonky. I mean, no offense.
It's fascinating, right?
It is, but just so we don't get too far too fast into like mitochondria, which I'm sure are amazing. I hear, like, when I hear about genetic changes, I think too, like, these things have happened over a very long period of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the first thing that comes into my mind, so when I'm thinking about adaptation, is changes in our environment that have been happening for not a long time. So I think about now, like basically the last 100 years, or since the Industrial Revolution, let alone the last 15 years, or since the iPhone. Like, here's my question. Given modernity and technology and sort of the wrench that throws into the mix of longevity and wellness, like, how fucked do you think we are, given, like, talk about variables? We've just now, like, turned the table upside down 100 times over. Like, it feels like every month and whether you look at it like Moore's law or whatever, it's getting faster
Yep.
to some kind of concrescence that I don't know what that's moving towards, whether you're kind of a singularitarian type or you're more like the utopian type or the Jesus type. I don't know. But there's a lot at play.
Yeah.
And so how do you think technology, what role this is playing? Like, how do we even make sense of it anymore? Because we're talking about the basics of cold. And so it's like there's a lot at play now. And it's
Yep.
true. I mean, I hear what you're saying. It's absolutely true.
Well, and that's why it's sort of interesting to get not to get lost in the deep science of genetics, but it's interesting what you said. Like it takes a long time for these adaptations to occur, and we still have a fundamental root in the sources of cold, heat, light, temperature, pressure, all these very basic things. And what you're talking about is this hyper novel environment, right? We are overstimulated, and we have so much novelty thrown at us, right? Energetically, visually, sound. Chemicals, metals, you name it. We've got foodstuffs that it's hard to even call them foods anymore to some degree. We've got so much coming at us. And so this is part of the reason why we find ourselves so sick, right, in the modern world. And when I mean sick, I mean the body and mind are trying to adapt to an environment, and it will, it can, given the right circumstances and enough time. But because of this hyper novelty and there's so much stimulus, it's very difficult for us to find center, to find rest. And so this is why so much depression, so much anxiety, so much ADD or ADD, whatever we want to call these things, these symptoms, they're just a symptom of us being in an environment that isn't producing harmony, that we're not aligned with our environment, right? And so we have to actually start to disconnect from so much of the stimulus. And it can be simple, right? It can actually be turning off the badges on your phone, right? All the notifications that we're getting, going for a walk in nature, right? And a lot of the work you do, it's using these sounds, right? There's something that are so deeply conditioned within us when it comes to these nature sounds, right? And you find this in indigenous healing work. They're reminding your body, your system of these sounds, of these deep connections that we have because they are ancient. So there's something important about connecting to this thread that is very ancient, and this hyper novelty, this hyper modern and hyper stimulus that we're experiencing is throwing us for sort of a biological wrench in our body. So we can't adapt at this rate.
Well, I mean, you're talking about longevity, just referencing, the book you sent me, Beyond Longevity. But I know you also mentioned right at the beginning about, well, is it really about living longer? Or is it about thriving?
Right.
I think we're all more interested in that, really, at the end of the day, if we had to ask ourselves. So, like, what are some things, before we hit the podcast record button, we were talking about how we met each other through John Dahlgren, who he and I are working on a documentary project together with some other folks as well. And you and John worked on a project called it was called the Longevity Project.
The Human Longevity Project. Yeah.
Which was you went around the world and you filmed all these people who are in the blue zones who've been living like super long time, and have this long series that people can watch as available. But you started to pick up on things that you're writing in this book that are like shared traits about really thriving beyond the fact that they happen to be very old. What do you think you gained from that that's very salient to like us living now today in 2023?
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of gets to the point that you brought up earlier about singularity and this idea that I think there's some people, there's a huge swath of people, because we're in this really interesting phase right now where we have regenerative medicine, which is a really exciting frontier. We're using things like biologics, like stem cells, and there's really cool things that I think that we're going to be able to take advantage of to make life better, to ease suffering and to age more gracefully. But then you have these other sort of technologies that there's this idea that we can live forever, that aging is a disease, and then we need to solve it. And technology is going to play some interesting role, whether that's, on the micro level or nanobots. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy ideas in my mind. That stuff's crazy. And it doesn't seem to me to fit into the bigger picture when you understand a little bit more about what life is and how it's operating. And so that was one of the things that we wanted to go out and I guess get a deeper understanding from some of the people that are, older, right? I mean, how can I talk about longevity, aging, and what it means to grow old at 42. I don't have the experience. I can talk about it from the mind. I can read studies about certain things, but it's really from these people that are in their 80s, 90s, and 100s that I think we can learn the most. And what you find in that is that there's a general acceptance that life is a process, right? And that aging is not a problem. That rather it's not a bug, it's a feature, right? And this idea that life has these finite limits, and we may not know what those are. It may be 120, it may be 140. There's a potential that we can increase it further. I'm open to that idea. And I think it's important to recognize that isn't the end goal. Even though there's a lot of people out there touting this idea, I'm going to live to 220 and this by doing this and that and that. And I think this is either marketing and sales, right? They're trying to sell you something, or they're so arrogant that they don't really understand what they're saying. And you just look around at all the evidence points to this idea that each species has this kind of, let's say, maximal lifespan, and then this average lifespan, right? You can look at elephant statistics, right? Elephants in the wild. You can look at lions in the wild. You can look at lions in captivity, which actually have a longer expected lifespan. So the environmental conditions for each species tends to set the lifespan that we can expect. Humans are no different, and we can do things about it too. Like we play a role in this thing we call longevity or life. And so to me, I think part of this idea of growing older, and what I noticed when I spoke with people, is that eventually they get to this point and they just kind of give up the trying. They're just like, well, whatever. It's in God's hands. Like I don't need to fight it anymore, right? I think when we're in our youth or in our middle ages, there's this like clinging to our youth, or this we try to reclaim it because we feel it slipping away. Like whether or not we acknowledge this, I think that's what's happening, and why there's this huge striving at when you see these 40s, 50s, and 60-year-olds thinking they're going to live a really long time. I think when we're young, it's this arrogance, and then we start to see this like it's slipping away. What can I do? Because I can still taste it. And then I think at some point you just recognize there ain't no going back. This is just what it is, and I'm cool with it. I lived a good life, and there's beauty along the way. That's what you find. You find with these people that have lived a long life that they enjoy the process of getting older, and that there is beauty in that process of getting older because you can't do as much. You naturally degenerate. There's less you can do, so you start to appreciate things more, right? I mean, I think we all inherently know this, right? When we're at the end of our rope, there's just something that allows us to see the bigger picture in a different way.
Yeah. And, you're talking about like, you mentioned something about our environment. And I just think about the things like the environmental toxins that we have to deal with now that weren't around as much. Everything from nanoplastics, just like toxicity in clothing that doesn't get talked about much. It seems like it's just a war on our senses and our bodies. And I praise how resilient our bodies really are. It's incredible. But it also seems like in the name of short-term profits and gains, we like turn a blind eye to, like, you have to be a detective when you go shopping for food. It's like, the word natural, for instance, like doesn't really mean anything. It's all this marketing versus organic has certain standards, but then you have to understand what that actually means too. And
it's exhausting, right?
It's tough.
I don't know how anybody does it. Like I'm in this field and I've done enough research and understanding on this stuff to the point where I think you just get to this recognition of there's a certain way to try to navigate this stuff as the best you can. Yeah. And then the rest you kind of have to let go of, right? I mean, I think that's kind of a theme in most of life, is that you do the best you can, and you try not to hold on too tight, because you'll drive yourself crazy if you really think, you'll be a hypochondriac if you think about the off-gassing from the carpets and the walls and the, all the things that are in the food and the water. And so you get to the point where, for example, with water, I don't need to continue to study all the chemicals and the drug residues and the things that might be in my tap water. I can simply learn how to get the best filtration system I can, or source a good water. And when I have to drink tap water, I drink a little tap water. if I'm in an airport and I don't have any other things and I got to drink out of a plastic water bottle, whatever the case, there's always circumstances, right? And instead of just losing your mind over that,
Yeah.
recognizing that we have the capacity to detoxify, we have the capacity to regenerate. And, they found chemicals in the polar ice caps. So there's this stuff's everywhere at this point. We can't, it's in newborns that haven't
Yeah,
even
breast
been
milk.
born,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so you just do the best you can.
Well, now it's part of being a human, I guess. And over
Yeah.
time, we'd probably adapt to it. It just will take some time. It's crazy.
True. Actually, there's research actually showing that some of this stuff on micro levels may actually induce a hormetic or beneficial effect at small levels. The other interesting part of that is that some chemicals have been shown to be more toxic at very low levels. So we don't really know what's happening. And then the combination of all these things is even more mind blowing. And so, again, you just kind of throw up your hands and go, what do? You do the best you can.
What are your thoughts on darkness retreats? I'm about to actually enter into one. And once this comes out, I've already done it in theory. And
is this a 10-day?
It's not a 10-day. I think it's 5. This place recommend this. I'm just doing what they recommend. They're like, this is what we found works the best. And I'm like, okay.
I'm super curious. I haven't done one yet. I really want to do one. I've done a 10-day silent meditation retreat, which in some ways you can say is the same. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think any kind of sensory deprivation is going to provide some level of insight that we just aren't aware of until we do it, right? I'm naturally curious, as I kind of know that you are as well, and so it's like these. I think what's cool about this is that we have these opportunities to go into these states and have these opportunities, whether it's with, indigenous plant medicines or whether it's with sound therapy, or we have these light, devices that can induce altered brain states. I mean, we can experiment and explore with these different things. But I think anytime we can reduce the sensory input, I think it's going to activate parts of us that we aren't really in touch with, or most of us haven't cultivated enough depth with yet. So it's that extreme type of environment that you're mentioning. I think it's going to really reveal things about you that only you can know and nobody can ever teach you, right? I mean, that's what's cool to me, is that's where you have to go to these kind of places, whether it's in meditation or with music or with plant medicines or with darkness or cold, right? Like, these are the extremes that can induce different physiological and mental states to allow our awareness to expand and basically touch new points that we wouldn't otherwise be able to have access to. And once we establish that, right, like, that's what's cool, is that it's like you get there, you have this experience, and now you will always have that as a reference that I think you never had before. So it just really expands your awareness of what it means to be human and what kind of experience you can have.
I can understand that. Yeah, and from some reading I've done recently on the darkness retreat, of course, I'll have a different opinion, I'm sure, when I come out of it. It's that while it has some crossover with some of those other experiences you mentioned and modalities, one thing that's a bit unique about it is that through the taking away of stimulus, so it's actually the opposite of something you're trying to do, like trying to get through the cold or succumbing to the medicine of a psychedelic. It's actually about allowing your autonomous system to do what it naturally does by doing other things less, and trusting its natural healing process and allowing like that healing to occur, which they're arguing like that occurs when you sleep.
Totally.
Which is very powerful. Maybe we could talk about sleep a bit, but you're really just sort of turning up the dial in a way by turning down the dial and allowing those natural processes. And wisdom has nothing to do with your thinking or decisions or even will. It's a lack of will in a sense. And that to me is very interesting because it's a very different approach than of Vipassana in a lot of ways for me. There's crossover. But
no question. And from kind of the Vedic approach, the act of seeing is an external process, right? It's a masculine process. It goes from your eyes outward, and so to take that away, all of a sudden, that's a massive amount of energy or stimulus that your resource that your brain now gets to dedicate to something else. And this could be, all kinds of conditioning and traumas and thoughts and things that we naturally suppress with this sensory input, right?
Yeah.
So we're so conditioned, right, to use our eyes. So when you take that away, now what are we left with, right? Especially if you're in basically a dark room and you're like, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, right? Except for just be with yourself. That's probably the scariest place that most of us can find.
I hope not.
Right?
I mean, I don't want to speak with any hubris whatsoever, but I'm also like, I want to like turn the head on like my story about it before I even go in. Instead of it feeling scary, I'm like, but what if on the other side, it's actually deeply nourishing to rest?
No question.
And it's like, I can walk in with these expectations of invitations for like rest and just like total self-compassion for like, no, you don't, no, you don't have to do that. It's like, just lie here a little while longer. I don't know. Or when you eat, I mean, I'll have to eat slowly anyway because it's dark. But
what else are you gonna do?
Well, there'll be that moment of like you're putting something in your mouth, like what is this? Like the old like you think it's orange juice and it's milk or something, and it's that kind of move in your brain.
Well, but that's actually it's interesting. I'd be curious to see if you do notice your taste buds change, right? So we know.
Oh my God, yeah, all sorts of things could. So a curiosity mindset of like, what is it like to? Yeah, all the things we take for granted. I mean, I imagine even just getting up to take a leak in the middle of the night will have a whole new meaning. We're like, where is the toilet? And it's going to take a while just to like, make that thing happen.
Yeah, no, I've heard amazing things, and I think that the difference that I think is interesting with sleep is that you are awake, so you're actually conscious, right? You're fully conscious, and having that sort of nervous system down regulation, that parasympathetic tone starts to increase while you're awake, right? That is interesting, and the other interesting component will be your sleep, right? Like because you don't have that light stimulus, it's the way our circadian rhythm is set is primarily through light, right? It comes into the eyes and hits the optic chiasm, speaks to parts of the brain, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the pineal, and that communicates to the rest of your body. So this is how we know to upregulate thyroid hormone and cortisol, and then downregulate melatonin and all these things. And that's not just the hormonal system. It's literally every cell in your body has what's called clock genes. And the 2017 Nobel Prize was awarded to scientists studying circadian biology and how we have these clock genes sitting in front of all the machinery essentially at the cellular level, so that your liver and your kidney and your spleen know what time of day it is to sort of perform certain operations, right? So this is what's wild, is that without that stimulus of light, you're going to have stimulus of food. And if you decide to do push-ups or any kind of movement, you'll have some stimulus there that is also playing a role in circadian rhythm. But that light is the big one. And so your biological clock, almost as if you're crossed over time zones, may get a little wonky, and you may end up.
I would assume so.
This is what I think would be the weirdest part for me. It's like, how do I know when to sleep, and how long am I sleeping? Is it 3 hours?
You have to let all that go.
Yeah,
right? I think knowing when to sleep would just be when you start falling asleep.
Let it go.
Then I'm guessing you'd wake up and be like, I don't even know how long I was asleep, and you just keep going back and forth. I heard you sleep a lot the first day, and then after that, it's just sort of in and out. And
that's what's wild. I mean, I'm super curious I'm excited to do that myself. I'm kind of jealous that you're going to be doing it soon.
I should probably say their name. It's the Darkness. It's in Ashland, Oregon.
Oh, really? Okay. I didn't know there was one
and
here.
They claim to be the only one around. It's called Sky Cave Retreats. Yeah.
I love it.
They came out, they reached out to me, which was, honestly, I wasn't seeking this out. It's more like one of those things when the universe puts it in front of you, you're just like, oh, Christ. All right.
I guess I'll say yes.
I know if I say no, I know what's going on here. So I got to do this.
Well, I'm curious about so the darkness is one thing, and all the navigation, but what's it going to be like for you without any, I don't know, whatever you do? Like without reading, without listening to music.
Doing is the hardest. Going to be not doing will be most definitely the most difficult thing, because I do a lot.
Yeah,
and I enjoy doing, and I also know that I have a level of addiction to just accomplishing tasks on the micro level and the major level. So just pausing everything I'm working on will be hard, and then of course in the moment, which would be much harder, is I'm not doing things. And although there's ways to do things, like you said, you can exercise, I will probably create some structure just to give myself some structure,
Yeah,
but happily willing to throw it out at any moment if the desire is just the rest.
totally.
So
Yeah.
that will always be the priority, but I'd like to have a few things to stand on, so to speak, in my invisible pocket. Should
Yeah.
I don't have much, but I heard there might be a bathtub. I'm hoping so, because I'll just take like 4 baths every, I don't even know what a day is, but it's basically whenever I want. I'll be like, all right, I'm taking a bath.
Well, I do remember in when I did the 10-day Vipassana, so for those who aren't familiar, it's basically 14 to 16 hours of meditation per day. You get, a breakfast that's kind of, or you eat tea for breakfast, essentially. You get a light lunch and essentially no dinner. Um, and you're not supposed to exercise. Like, you're not supposed to really, you can walk, but you're not supposed to really do any kind of yoga or any kind of movement. The idea is to really just settle everything down. And you have a little bit of time when you're not meditating, but you have nothing to do. Right. And the last thing you want to do is more meditation, or at least that's the last thing I wanted to do, is more meditation, because I was doing 16 hours. And what I noticed was I had all these ideas, right? Like, because my mind really finally settled, right? I had all these ideas, but I couldn't write them down, because you can't write and you can't listen. There's nothing you can take with you. There's no phone, of course. And so that was what was the hardest for me, was I had all these insights and ideas, whether it was with business or in my life or things I wanted to implement, and I couldn't write them down. And so that's what I found was very fascinating, was just not being able to record things.
Well, whatever I write down, it's going to be like, can you decipher it later? Yeah. It's like I'll write on top of myself the whole time. It's like, oh,
Right.
great. There were the answers. And now it's just like one big maze of lines. Did you find any connection with people's longevity or thriving with creativity or their expression of art or things like that?
Well, it's kind of interesting, because the people that we spoke with, they're from these small villages, right, in Sardinia, in the mountains, right, Ikaria, Greece, this tiny island in Okinawa, and not just the city centers of Okinawa, but like in the village, rural areas. And these are people that didn't have electricity until like 1960, right? So when I interviewed them at, let's say 100 years old, they lived 50 plus years of their life without electricity. So their relationship with exercise, their relationship with creativity, their relationship with, let's say, wellness practices is very different than our relationship, right? We might have dedicated things that we say, this is a creative endeavor, or I'm expressing my creativity in this way, or I'm doing exercise here. Their exercise was infused to their daily life. Creativity was infused with everything they did, because they were cultivating crops. They were, shepherds. They were, using the earth and the seasons. They were flowing with everything. They were immersed in creativity itself, which is nature. So they were utilizing nature. They were following nature. They had to get creative because they didn't have an abundance of resource. But nobody I spoke with did any exercise. Nobody I spoke, kids, they played, of course, but as adults, they didn't have dedicated exercise in any way. There was no
weren't
leisure.
They like walking 3 hours, it said? And like, I mean, they're usually,
At least. Some of these,
they were doing a lot of activity, physical
nonstop.
activity.
But they would walk 30 to 40 kilometers, to get some cheese or to get fish down by the ocean, and then walk back 30 kilometers home, or they would shepherd their sheep, right, and walk 30 kilometers a day, or they would,
right,
whatever the case was, but they were infused into their daily life. So was creativity. They didn't do a ton of art. I mean, of course, there were certain people that were, local artists and that kind of thing, but it was a different relationship, because it was built into their day to day a little bit differently than it is in our world. So we tend to kind of have these segmented activities, right? Here I'm doing my work. Now I'm going to go do something creative. Now I'm going to go do exercise, right? Theirs was infused, and it followed the rhythm of the day, even to the point of siestas and naps, right? They worked that into their day in a way that made sense. So it's very interesting to look at those cultures, because there's so much wisdom to be gained, and yet I don't think that we're ever going to be able to model or mimic their lifestyle, because it was so retrospective.
Different life, different time.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, in that sense, what are you hopeful about aside from some of these technological or scientific advancements like stem cells? And I
Yeah,
mean, are you hopeful about the? Because
totally.
I mean, our longevity on the level of our lifespan has been going down
It has.
uh,
Yeah.
as an aggregate, and I don't know if that's global, but it's probably Western at least. I mean, the Western stuff is pretty much permeated just about everywhere.
And that's what we see too in these longevity regions, these blue zones, is that actually they're not blue zones anymore. Many of them, because of the Western influence that has taken over,
Yeah.
and the globalization. In other words, the people that lived there aren't staying there; they're actually traveling outside now, and so we're losing sort of the isolation. Um, but I'm extremely hopeful. I'm more excited than I've ever been. I remember 10 or 15, probably 15 years ago, maybe, yeah, 15 years ago. So when I kind of awoke to some of these, well, we might say red pilled on a lot of the different things that I was seeing in my environment, whether it was the financial world or the government aspect and big pharmas and, all the interconnected, swampy, mess that we're seeing in the power structures. And I was kind of depressed, right? I was like, oh my God, like, how are we going to get out of this? And I imagined the sort of revolution, if you will, this resurgence of life affirming qualities to look very differently. What I see now is that these are all crumbling. These power structures are crumbling. They're still there, but they're very wobbly, right? And the younger generations aren't really into them as much as our parents were. So I'm seeing everything start to shift. The ground is very shaky. We're going to have a lot of destruction, but that's kind of what has to happen if we want these systems to fall. We got to break some of this stuff down. We've got to break through it. I think what I feel is energetically, globally, collectively, we're in the midst of a childbirth, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
about to give birth, right? And there's tons of pain, and it feels awful, right? It's going to be messy, and it's going to deliver something new that we are going to witness, that we're going to get to experience. And even in a childbirth scenario, right, there's complications, right? The mother may have some wounds that may need to be healed, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of that going on. But I'm seeing, we can go back to the indigenous prophecies, right? The eagle and the condor, right? Just one of my favorites, right? Which is this idea that the eagle represents the masculine, the West, the intellectual, the mental, kind of framework, and then the condor, which represents the southern, the indigenous, the heart-based communities. The eagle almost overtook the condor, and that was prophesied many years ago, hundreds or if not thousands of years ago. It was prophesied that the eagle would overtake the condor to such a degree that life itself would be in danger. And yet there would be an opportunity at a certain point in history where the eagle and the condor could fly together, right, and give birth to a new way of being. And to me, that's exactly what I'm seeing. We're seeing the ayahuascas coming out of the jungle all over the world. Like, that is remarkable to me, something that's been preserved for thousands of years in very select parts of the world and literally protected, right? In the deepest way, has now emerged, albeit a little messy, no question, but it's coming, right? We're now seeing sound therapy, right? Something you're very much involved with, but this idea of using sound in so many ways to induce healing, to remember who we are, to really recalibrate things on a very basic level. We're using light, right? So these ancient ways, the yogas, the qigongs, the tai chis, these are old ancient practices. The Ayurvedas, Chinese medicines, they've infused the West, right? And now we're also seeing this tie back to these indigenous cultures that have needed our help, right? To maintain stability, let's say in the rainforest, for example, in some of these tribes in these regions. We can actually infuse some financial stability in some of these places. So we're finding some really interesting things happening. I think the ancient is making a resurgence. The new is also coming online, and then we also have this other thing, which is this technocratic, AI thing that's kind of emerging, which is something that's interesting that we're going to have to contend with as well. But I think the ancient wisdoms will help us navigate this AI world in a way that allows for us to find safety and stability and harmony going forward albeit again, probably messy.
Yeah, I would pour a little water on that. My perspective is like a little less sanguine, and I think about like the fact that any of our sort of savior mentality to quote unquote ancient things, just things that came before us, where the Western thing is the thing that destroyed it. I mean, it's sort of the Western consumption is what's screwing the rainforest, and then we're supposed to go back and support it and make it sustainable. There's something kind of messed up about that. And I think about, and I do agree that we're going through a fundamental transition that could be akin to childbirth. But I also look at like the systems requiring change that have so much power, they're so entwined that make this world turn, that I don't see other ways other than those things collapsing. I don't see them evolving to a somewhat. Maybe it only takes like 10% of it evolving. I don't know. I have a feeling it's like yeast in bread. It's a small additive,
Totally,
but it will make the loaf rise. So it's like, no, it's not like the whole world, like Exxon and all, they're all suddenly gonna be like, you know what, we're going to do this differently. But what if there's enough critical mass that it could start pushing things in the right direction? Because those other systems will ultimately continue to collapse, and the systems of power will hold on quite cravenly.
totally.
Just looking at the span of their own lifetimes and just wanting to get their own pleasure and power out of it. Because a lot of these things we're talking about too are in positions of privilege where a lot of people are like, I don't have access to any of that stuff, ancient or new. It's like, even though like what they're all pointing to is a human right, like your wellness, your ability to go within and self-power, but it's sort of like all the systems that are pressing that down is also something that we're hoping to change, so that ideally we have more equality in the access to all this stuff. We don't, what kind of casualties will there be as the systems start to evolve? And inevitably right now it is quite out of balance.
Yeah, no question. I think there's going to be a ton of casualties. Unfortunately, I don't know if I think anything's possible, but from what I can see and envision and feel through, there will be a lot of casualties, and it's unfortunate, and it's also a reminder of why it's important to do the work, right? Why it's important to do the inner work, to find salvation within, to awaken ourselves to a point, to be able to navigate the world in a harmonious way, right? So there's a lot of social justice ideation out there. I was an energy efficiency engineer for a while. That was my previous profession.
Energy efficiency engineer?
Yeah.
That's a lot of E's. What does that mean exactly?
It's a good question. I actually never figured that out. Because,
is this a degree or that was a job position?
It was a job. I essentially would go into buildings, whether it was, let's say, a college campus or usually a government associated building, but we'd figure out ways to quote unquote, and I heavy emphasis on the quotes, to save energy.
Well, I didn't know if you meant like you were living in Topanga Canyon and this was a shocker balancing. Yeah, it could be. You're an energy efficiency engineer. I was like, oh, that's a brilliant way. That's a whole new thing you could do.
I wish I was doing that instead.
Be more efficient with your sacred energy.
Exactly.
It's efficiency, or more productive.
There's definitely something there.
Yeah.
But what I found was that, it was a lot of nonsense. It was a lot of
like the greenwashing of like, well, you could put on this, but if you look at the full picture of, that technology.
The deeper you get into it, the more you realize it's just kind of nonsense. And look, it doesn't mean people are bad. It doesn't mean the intentions are bad. It just means that it's not what you think it is. And so I find this to be the case, that there's a lot of stuff that we think we're doing good. We're wanting to do good, right? There's something within us deeper than our hearts, no question, that we want to improve things. And also, a lot of the times we can look at ourselves and actually recognize that I'm not living that way. Even though I might be preaching it, I'm not living it to the fullest. And so to me, this is where the inner work, this is why these ancient traditions, the Qigongs, the meditation practices, the breath works, all of these things that are resurging in the West, in my opinion, are doing so for a reason. These are deep, deep needs that we have to awaken to ourselves. And when you awaken to yourself and you break the conditioning, the cultural conditioning, which is so ingrained, which is the problem, right? Terence McKenna is very famous for this, right? The culture is not your friend, right? This idea that that you think you're living freely, but most of you is not, right? We are prisoners of this conditioning. And there's very few of us that are not living through condition most of the time. And so the question that we have is, what is condition and what is free? What is this free being? And how do I cultivate more freedom within myself and let go of this conditioning, which isn't bad. It just is. But nevertheless, it's not you operating from you, right? So this cultural conditioning is the thing that's guiding us as a society. This is the ultimate control structure, is this conditioning, right? So that's what we need to break free from. We are all prisoners within this cultural conditioning. And it comes from the family unit, it comes from the larger culture as a whole, but that we can only break free with these practices, with the meditations, with this darkness retreat, with the breath works, with the ayahuascas, with the qigongs, all of these things that have been cultivated through various lineages throughout human history are the things that are bringing us back to ourselves, bringing us back to our own hearts. And this is how we let go of these structures. We can't dismantle them, from the outside in. Like it's very difficult, and clearly it has a lot of shrapnel associated, right? Like we dismantle
too
them
powerful
from within. That's right.
Yeah.
And this is a Gandhi approach, right? Like there are people who have done this and have understood how to best dismantle these big power structures, and it looks totally different than I think what most people are trying to do.
Yeah, inner work can be disruptive behavior to the machine. But, if there's any through line here I'm sort of picking up on, in some ways it's about simplicity, because
100%.
while we can have perhaps amazing inventions or sort of layers we can add on, or the new widgets and so forth, what worked in the past is still available to us now. Like when you simplify your life, for instance, I'm going to buy a Tesla or a Prius or whatever. But you maybe, I don't know, I bet if you look deeply at the lithium and the batteries, it's like, doesn't look so as pretty as you thought. It's like, just buy a used car. It's like, that would actually do better probably. Or like buy used clothing, not just because it's cheap, because like, well, it less chemicals. Yeah, it goes on and on. It's just simplifying and doing less in that way, or just, it's probably the easiest answer. And if everyone just had one kid, I'm not saying you got to do that.
I got one. I can tell you that's good advice.
Terrence McKenna, he asked the mushroom, apparently, like, what do we do? And they said every human being should bear no more than one child, if you can, within reason.
Sure.
And within, 100 years, I think we get down to 1 billion or 2 people through just normal lifetimes. And talk about the pressure cooker going down a bit.
Well, it's funny because what you landed on is the same conclusion I landed on when I was an energy efficiency engineer. Well, we had these things. We would monitor energy usage, and we'd pull utility bills. We do all this back end calculations and figure out if we did this thing here, we will save you X amount of energy next year. And so spend 10,000 on this because we're going to save you 2,000, and in 5 years you break even, right? So we did all this energy engineering stuff. And then what I realized was the most effective strategy: turn off the light. You don't need the sensors. Close the windows, right? Like you can do things, and this is what it came down to. All this stuff that we were doing was making the assumption on how the building was being used. And so if the person, let's say a teacher in a school, opened the window, then all this mechanical engineering and control systems and all the things we're doing goes out the window, because you just opened the window and it's 40 degrees outside because you were a little hot, and now we're wasting a ton of energy. So the point is it's how are you using your life? Your insight is very simple and very profound, because in the health world, one of the things that I walk people through to help them heal, one of the simplest things you can do is go throughout your house and get rid of clutter. This means old clothes that you have nostalgic ties to. Get rid of them. Give them away. Somebody can surely use the things that you're not using. Clean up the things that we're not using. Increase the space. This holds true in Vastu Shastra, which is Ayurveda's energies of spaces, right? So we know this, that the energy of spaces has a flow to it. And so if we have too much clutter, it actually, the energy gets stuck and blocked. So we can go through our house and we can do this. We can do this with our diets. So instead of buying the organic apple chips for $4.99, just buy an organic apple. Better yet, plant an apple tree in your backyard. Now you have apples, right? So you can see the level to which we can take this. Just because you're eating organic apple chips, that's great, but it comes in packaging. There's a whole process to it. It's not nearly as healthy as the actual apple itself, right? So we can go through our chemicals, our shampoos, our facial products, everything about our lives, and we can slowly dismantle the conditioning that says you need all this stuff in order to be happy, in order to be healthy, in order to be a certain way, and really figure out what's true for you. And most of us, what we find is that we don't need all this stuff. We don't need as many things as we really are taking part in. And so when you start to simplify your life, and this doesn't mean becoming a total minimalist, right? Although that's great for some. I don't think many people really love that. We can simplify. And by simplifying everything that we're doing, thinking, all our behaviors, then you start to open up some time. You start to open up space. You have more freedom within your day. And this is where more creativity can come in, right? This is where more of you can have space to emerge, right? And figure out what it is you want truly in your life. So there's so much there when we simplify. And honestly, it is the answer going forward. It's not doing more things, which I think is kind of perhaps one of the insights that you have about the darkness retreat. It's like, it's doing less.
I like making things. I mean, I have deep satisfaction in creativity. So I mean, I guess there's nothing stopping me from being creative in that space, but I just have to,
Looks different.
Let it all go. I could sing a song. Yeah. I mean,
right.
There's not a lot I could do, but it's so cool what we can make these days. Like as we're doing this podcast in the background, like I'm bouncing a 4-hour like ceremony, and I can't believe all that's happening right now. It's probably processing like 1 trillion things at once, like things you just couldn't dream of doing, years ago on a laptop.
I know, it's wild. But the other thing too is that like there's a difference between it's really where are you doing things from, right? So are you doing things from the heart? Are you doing things from a place of well-being? If you are from a place of flow, then do as much as you can, right? Like that's a very good thing to do from that place. But if we're doing from conditioning, if we're doing from a wound, then we're just going to perpetuate more suffering, right? We're going to, so it's really this idea of doing versus being. It's all well and good to sort of meditate with that and really get with that and get intimate with what that means to you. And also, it's not bad to do, right? Like it's just where are you doing from? Because some people will do meditation from a place of trying to accomplish something. Right? And from my experience, while meditation can be used that way, there's deeper realizations to be had when you meditate from a place of just being, right? So instead of trying to accomplish something from your meditation, it's just actually being in meditation allows something to unfold within you. So this is a really key concept that I think took me a long time to even have a hint of understanding, and I'm constantly wrestling with, and anytime I look back and something went awry, if I can pinpoint, from what energy did I do that thing, or did I take that action? Did I make that choice? What energy was I in? What was my state? Where did that come from? Was it a place of trying to get a need met, or did it come from a place of true desire, true well-being from the heart? Usually what I find is the outcomes are very, very different when I do something from conditioning or wounding or from a place of need.
Yeah. It's that trusting, like we we're talking about the autonomous system, like I think that's how you say it, but trusting a process that's natural, as opposed to like the brain trying to grasp and the hubris of like, no, I got this, or I mean, try doing that in an ayahuasca ceremony or something. And it's like, so it's really the simplicity in some ways is showing that trust. It's a way of laying yourself on the altar to be like, well, I do the things, but there's so many things that I'm not in control of. And you talked about people who eventually gave up, but really surrendered into the bliss of not grasping so hard. And that is a kryptonite-like energy to what the mainstream story is the opposite. It's control.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a good takeaway and perhaps a good place to close. It's just kind of simplicity, trust, the beingness being the answer. And you could understand then why some of these other modalities or just looking within gives you more insight to that, as opposed to being an escape or like a salve that you have to, or like a chore.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what we find, right? I mean, I've certainly used them in that way plenty of times, and continue to, right? So there's still times I'll find myself and I'm like, oh man, I was really trying to escape something there. I was trying to avoid something. Or I was trying to solve a problem, right? That's kind of a big one that I've noticed for me, is I'm always trying to solve a problem, and so the idea of surrender is recognizing that there is no problem to be solved, right? There's just things to navigate. There's curiosities, right? Curiosity is fantastic, but that's different than trying to solve a problem. And so, navigating this way of being, I think, is one of the biggest takeaways I got from interviewing, people in their 90s, 100s. They kind of just let go and let God, right? They just let it all go. And I don't know if they were like that throughout their whole lives, but I did get the sense that at some point, by the time I interviewed them, they had this recognition that they're not in control. And they're just showing up, right? And that we can all turn it over, right? And so this idea of surrender is great as a mental concept, but there's a deep embodiment that can happen. And I think that's why these practices that are, again, resurging in the West are sort of helping us to get to this point of an embodied realization of these deep wisdoms, of these deep truths, of which simplicity is a big one, right? That's an embodied understanding. There's a mental concept, and that's great. And when it finally lands in the body, in the system, then there's no efforting that has to happen. It just is, and you relax into the way things are. So again, it is embodied. This is the key, I think, takeaway, key aspect to navigating these things is, can you embody it? And in my experience, embodying something tends to involve the body. Like, you have to have a somatic experience in a big way to sort of move some of this stuff, to really have it ingrained, so to speak, in the nervous system.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, it's a natural process.
It's going to happen.
So it's sort of like, the good news is it's about allowing versus figuring out the keys or something.
And we're going to die. Right? Like, I'll end it here. You're going to die.
Hey, man.
Right?
Yeah, bummer. All right. So, be all right. Jason Prall, thank you. We're going to die. That's the title of his book. That is sort of that's sort of like the other polarity of the title. But it's like longevity for the sake of, I guess, enjoying more of it. I don't know.
No, meditate on death, right? And see what you figure out. You really, I think, start to recognize the value.
I'm just
of
joking.
life.
I'm sorry.
Right?
I don't mean to sound glib, but of course, yes. No, it's a great book. It's well written and some great ideas in here. And beyond this, I mean, what's the best way for people to find you or interact with you?
Yeah, they can go to awakenedhealthacademy.com. It's where I got a lot of my health content and kind of awakening trauma practices and that kind of thing. Probably the best place to find me.
Do you work with people individually, or?
Yeah, that's primarily what I do. Yeah, working with people using awareness-based techniques that allow for healing, basically providing them with a nervous system, so to speak, and showing up in a way that allows their system to naturally process some of the backlog of experiences, the stuck experiences that they may not know are there, that are creating issues. And so I don't do any healing, of course. I just show up in the way that I can and follow the natural emergence of what wants to come forth, and resolution or healing, if we want to call it that, sort of tends to happen. So these are really cool techniques I've learned from some amazing teachers that have studied in a tremendous amount of lineage, like 3 or 4 or 5 different lineages from the East, and pulled it all together in some pretty cool practices. And so this is what's possible, just being in connection with the right energy. Things just happen, right?
Do you feel like the energetic work, sort of like, I went right to the chapter about unconscious stuff, like traumas, and because I've had a lot of interaction. Well, thank you, Jason, for coming on the show. If you'd like to hear the rest of this conversation, just hop over to our Patreon. That's patreon.com/eastforest, and find a way to support. That's where we can share lots of things, including extras from the podcast like this. But check out Jason. Check out the film that he and John Dahlgren worked on, and check out the book and lots of other things he has to offer. The links are in the show notes down there. And thank you to everyone who already supports on the Patreon thus far. This song that you're hearing in the background, it's called "You Know." I mean, this song comes from way back. I actually had another podcast that was in 2010 or something, and it was called Sound Healing Bites. Don't try to search it. It's not up anymore. I took it down. I did it for a year, did 64 episodes. It was just music. It was just little improvisations of music called Sound Healing Bites. This was one of them. 10 of those little improvisations became an album called Music Meditations. That is in my catalog. I listened to it, I'm like, wow, that was a long time ago. Feels not like music I make now. I try not to judge it, of course, but this one had a very sweet simplicity. And so here it is. Here it is for you to enjoy. Thanks for listening. Thanks for all the support. You can always reach out at team@eastforest.org. And social media, of course, East Forest and East Forest Music. And we look forward to seeing some of y'all at Esalen or the Ram Dass Retreat in August. And got some events coming up, of course, that we'll be announcing soon in the U.S. and Europe. So get on the newsletter. That's the best way to know when tickets are available or where we're going to be in the world. Until then, you keep walking your walk. Don't take any shit. But if you do it with grace.